It's time now for Perspective, and we're heading to Russia, where a crackdown on opposition leader Alexei Navalny and his movement is showing no signs of abating, with a Moscow court on Wednesday ordering the arrest of one of Navalny's top advisors, Leonid Volkov. Navalny himself was jailed last week after returning from Germany, where he spent months recovering from a nerve agent attack he and many Western countries blame on the Kremlin. So who exactly is Navalny, and just how scared should Putin be? My guest today is Luke Harding, foreign correspondent at The Guardian newspaper and author of Shadow State, Murder, Mayhem and Russia's Remaking of the West. Thank you very much for being with us on France 24 today. Now, you've written in recent weeks that Alexei Navalny poses the greatest threat yet to Vladimir Putin's presidency. What is it exactly that makes Navalny such a thorn in Putin's side?
I think several things. One of them is that he's pointing out the obvious, that after 2 decades of Vladimir Putin, Russia has become a really spectacularly corrupt country at all levels, with the people at the top, and indeed those at the middle of the kind of bureaucracy, stealing billions and billions of dollars at a time when ordinary Russians have seen their living standards fall quite dramatically over the last 5 years. And I think the other thing about Navalny, which makes him rather special, is that he's modern. He is funny. The video that he did exposing Putin's alleged palace on the Black Sea coast has been seen 110 million times on YouTube. And he has this unrivaled ability to get under Vladimir Putin's skin, to treat him with disrespect, and to describe him, as he did last week, as a thieving little man in a bunker.
And, you gave an example of it just there. He does use humour to great effect, and that's something quite new in Russian politics, isn't it?
Well, it is. I mean, Vladimir Putin is very many things, but I think it's fair to say that he is not good at laughing at jokes, especially if they're made at his expense. This critique is also, I think, kind of generational. I mean, Navalny talks about Putin as grandfather, and I think it also strikes a chord with many Russians, because this is indubitably a kind of aging regime. It's made up primarily of 60-something, 70-something former KGB officers. It's pretty male. It's rather Soviet, certainly in its thinking and its appearance. And Navalny, by contrast, is a master of social technology, social media. He's got huge numbers of followers, 2.5 million followers on Twitter. And he uses the web as a way to sort of go over state propaganda channels and talk directly to the Russian people.
Now, Navalny is, of course, behind bars now, with more criminal cases against him likely in the coming weeks and months. But many seeing his jailing as only adding to his appeal. He is now, after all, a symbol as well as a political figure. Would you agree with that?
Yes, I would. And the paradox actually is the Kremlin has made Navalny a national figure by really kind of persecuting him over a period of time. So for a long time, Vladimir Putin has not really known what to do with Navalny. I mean, he's been arrested several times previously. He's been attacked. And then, of course, last summer, we have this, according to Navalny, attempt by the FSB spy agency to kill him with Novichok, a lethal nerve agent. And I think the regime gambled that Navalny would stay in exile. He spent almost 5 months recuperating in Germany. But instead, what we saw last month is that he flew back to Moscow and set off a whole series of street protests in his favor. And I don't think this means the end of Vladimir Putin. I don't think the Russian government is going to fall anytime soon. But it does feel like a historical moment. There's a sort of whiff of transformation in the air, of change, or the prospect of change. And this is something that Navalny has come himself to embody.
And tens of thousands of people have turned out on the streets of Russia in recent weeks in support of Navalny. Thousands have been arrested. You worked as a correspondent in Moscow for a number of years. Were you surprised to see such extraordinary support for a controversial opposition figure like Navalny?
I mean, I was surprised by the breadth, the deep rootedness of these protests. It's clear that something's been smouldering under the surface in Russia for a long time. I mean, we have seen protests before, um, big ones in 2011, 2012, against election fraud. But we saw people demonstrating in Crimea, occupied Crimea, which Russia annexed in 2014. We saw about 50 people in Yakutia, which is one of the most freezing places in the earth, coming out in -50 to protest. And from what I gather, it's not just that people are kind of enraptured with Navalny, it's that he has sort of crystallized a feeling of discontent and voicelessness among many Russians who see that the people who rule them are very remote, but also, I would say, deeply, profoundly corrupt.
And what exactly are Navalny's politics? Of course, he's a thorn in the side of the Kremlin with his anti-corruption stance, but many people are also keen to point out that he's something of a nationalist. What are Navalny's politics?
I mean, that's certainly true, or it certainly has been true that when he came to public prominence, he was there was a sort of famous march of Russian nationalists in 2007, which he attended, and this is the sort of stick the Kremlin uses to beat him with. I mean, I think his politics have evolved since then. He's more, I would say, kind of pro-European Democrat. And when I talked last week to Leonid Volkov, one of his senior aides that you mentioned in your introduction, and I said, well, how do you characterize his politics? And Volkov said, essentially center left. He's in favor of a minimum wage. And of course, his main platform is to end lawlessness, corruption, which is rampant in Russia, and to have a kind of proper judicial system, fair courts, and so on. But I mean, it's sort of it's tricky to kind of discuss his politics when at the moment he's sort of sitting behind bars with zero prospect of release and no opportunity whatsoever to take part in competitive elections, which of course is what he's been calling for.
And if he is one day allowed to take part in competitive elections, do you think he stands a chance of being the Russian president?
I mean, if this were Hollywood, I would say yes, of course, but it isn't Hollywood. It's a ruthless, thuggish government we're talking about here, which has accumulated huge resources and will defend that using a loyal security apparatus and TV propaganda and so on. So I don't envisage a fairy tale ending of Navalny being president, but I do see him as being someone who can articulate popular discontent. And certainly the regime feels more kind of precarious than it has done for a long time. We've seen protests in Belarus next door, which have been going on for months, discontent in Russia's Far East. And I do think we are in a transitional phase, but that may end up with certainly more months of repression. And it may end up with some new faces being shuffled into what is essentially a rather ruthless postmodern autocracy that is domestically repressive and, of course, internationally a problem for the European Union and for France.
Luke Harding, a foreign correspondent at The Guardian. I'm afraid we're going to have to leave it there. Thank you very much for speaking to us here on France 24 today.